In July 1984, a healthy 5-month-old named Benjamin Dowling was handed to his babysitter. He never came home that way. She shook him so hard the vessels feeding his brain tore, and yet he didn't pass that day, or that year. He lived another 35 years with the damage done in a single afternoon, and the babysitter who caused it wouldn't answer for his passing until nearly 4 decades later. That delay is the part almost nobody talks about. We picture the threat to a child as a stranger in a parking lot. In every case here, the danger was invited through the front door, handed a baby, and left alone. 10 nannies across 3 countries and 4 decades. 10 families who did everything right and trusted the wrong person. By the end, what becomes clear is just how ordinary that trust looks, right up until the breaking point. Section 1. Christine Falling. In the small towns of North Florida in the early 1980s, finding someone to watch your kids was a simple thing. Money was tight for most families. There was no fancy daycare down the street, and very few people could afford to pay a trained nanny. So parents did what parents in small places had always done. They asked a neighbor. They asked the teenage girl from a few houses over who needed a little money and seemed gentle with children. Nobody ran a background check. Nobody asked for papers. There was a knock on the door, a few friendly words, and the handshake built entirely out of trust. Christine Falling was one of those girls. She was young, she was always willing, and she did not ask for much. To the families in Blountstown and the towns around it, she looked like a blessing. A babysitter who actually liked babies and never said no. What those families did not know was that children kept passing in her care. She was born on March 12, 1963, in Perry, Florida. Her birth name was Christine Slaughter, which is the kind of dark coincidence that nobody could have planned. Her family was poor, and her early years were hard in almost every way a childhood can be hard. By many accounts, she was treated badly as a small child, and grew up without much steady love or safety. She also had a medical condition that caused seizures, and she had to take medicine to keep them under control. Her life did not get calmer as she grew older. As a teenager, she was sent to the hospital again and again. She would arrive saying she felt sick, that something was wrong inside her, but the doctors could rarely find anything they could point to or treat. The visits piled up into the dozens. Something in her wanted attention or care, or maybe just a place where someone would look at her closely. The hospitals could not give her whatever it was she was looking for. When she was only 14, she was married off to a man much older than she was. The marriage fell apart in a matter of weeks, full of fighting from almost the first day. By her mid-teens, she was already a young woman who had been through more than most adults, and very little of it had taught her how to be calm or safe around others. There were warning signs even earlier in the way she treated animals. By some accounts, as a young girl she would hurt cats, dropping them from high places or harming them. People around her did not seem to know what to make of it. In a poor, busy household where nobody was watching very carefully, a strange child was just a strange child. By her late teens, Christine had found a way to make money. She watched young children for friends, neighbors, and relatives. She was cheap, she was nearby, and she always seemed happy to help. For working parents with no other options, that combination was hard to turn down. So they handed her their babies and went off to their jobs or their errands, believing their children were in safe hands. The first passing came in February 1980. A little girl named Cassidy Johnson, only 2 years old, was in Christine's care. At first, the adults around her thought the child had simply gotten sick. She was taken to a doctor and seemed unwell, and a few days later, on the last day of February, she passed. When her body was examined afterward, doctors found signs of an injury to her head. Christine said the child had fallen. One doctor felt that something about the story did not add up, and he tried to pass along a warning so the police might look more closely at the babysitter. That warning got lost somewhere in the system. No one followed it. The case was quietly closed, written off as the sad and sudden passing of a sick toddler. For a while, that explanation held. Crib passing was a real and known thing. Babies sometimes passed in their sleep for reasons no one could fully explain, and grieving families were not eager to imagine anything worse. So when more children began to pass, each passing was treated as its own small tragedy rather than as part of a pattern. But the pattern was there. Over the next 2 years, more young children stopped breathing while they were alone with Christine falling. The stories were almost always the same. The parent would leave the child in her care, healthy and fine. The parent would come back or get a phone call and learn that the baby had suddenly gone still. The babysitter would say she had no idea what happened. The child had been napping or playing and then was simply gone. One of those children was an 8-month-old named Jennifer Daniels. On a July day in 1981, her mother left her with Christine just long enough to go and buy groceries. It was the kind of short, ordinary errand that parents run 100 times without a second thought. When the mother returned, she was told her baby was not breathing. Another was a tiny boy named Travis Dwayne Coleman. He was only 10 weeks old, barely more than a newborn, when he passed suddenly in July 1982 while at Christine's home in Blountstown. By the time it was all over, at least 5 children who had been left in Christine Falling's care were lifeless. Her name was also connected to the passing of an elderly man she had worked for, though it was the children that drew the eye and broke the heart. 5 small lives, each one ended in a quiet house on an ordinary day. Each one handed over by someone who loved them and believed they were doing the responsible thing. The hardest question is why it took so long for anyone to stop it. Part of the answer is simple grief. When a baby passes, the people around the family do not rush to accuse anyone. They bring food, they cry. They tell the parents it was no one's fault. The idea that the friendly girl who babysat might have done something on purpose was almost too dark to think, so most people did not think it. Part of the answer was the way these towns and their records worked back then. The passings happened across different places and were handled by different people. There was no single person sitting at a desk who could see all of them lined up next to one another. Each one looked like a single drop of rain. No one was watching long enough to notice the storm. And part of the answer is that crib passing gave everyone a way to avoid the worst conclusion. It was a real medical reality, and it fit the surface of what they were seeing. A baby healthy one moment and gone the next. That explanation let the families and the doctors close the door on something unbearable. Eventually, the door would not stay closed. Too many children had passed around the same young woman. When investigators finally sat Christine down and questioned her, the truth she gave them was worse than anything they had braced for. She confessed. She told them she had stifled the children, pressing blankets or coverings over their small faces until they stopped breathing. She described holding a child down until the little body turned a deep color and went limp. She also gave a reason that made the whole thing even stranger and more frightening. She said she heard voices. The voices, she claimed, told her to unalive the babies. She spoke about all of it with a flatness that unsettled the people listening, as if she were describing chores rather than the passings of children. That calm is one of the things that still makes this case so hard to sit with. There was no dramatic struggle that the neighbours could have seen and stopped. There was no obvious monster that the parents could have spotted at the door. There was a quiet young woman in a quiet house, doing something terrible in the small, unwatched hours when a baby was supposed to be safely napping. The betrayal at the centre of it is almost too large to measure. These were not children grabbed off the street by a stranger. They were placed into Christine's arms by their own mothers and fathers. The trust that a parent gives a babysitter is one of the deepest kinds of trust there is. It says, in plain terms, that the most precious thing in my life is safe with you. Christine Falling took that trust again and again, used the safety it gave her to do harm. Her own broken life explains some of how a person could become so damaged. The poverty, the early mistreatment, the seizures, the marriage forced on a 14-year-old, the endless hospital visits where she kept reaching for a kind of care she never seemed to get. All of it adds up to a young woman who was failed by nearly everyone around her long before she ever held a child in her care. Understanding that is not the same as excusing it. Plenty of people live through terrible childhoods and never harm a soul. Whatever the voices were, and whatever was true about her mind, the result was a row of tiny graves. The legal end of the story came in December 1982. Christine Falling pleaded guilty to unaliving 3 of the children. The 3 were Cassidy Johnson, the first little girl whose passing had been waved away as illness, along with baby Jennifer Daniels and 10-week-old Travis Coleman. In exchange for that guilty plea, the state agreed not to bring charges in the other passings, and the capital punishment was taken off the table. Her own confession was the thing that saved her life. The judge sentenced her to life in prison. She was still a teenager when the cell door closed behind her, a young woman who had already done a lifetime's worth of harm. Under the rules of her sentence, she would one day be allowed to ask for parole, a chance to argue for her freedom. That day came after she had served 25 years. In 2017, her case went before a parole board. They turned her down. By some accounts, not a single person showed up to speak in her favor. The girl whom families had once trusted with their children now sat alone, with no one willing to stand at her side and ask the world to give her another chance. She remains locked up at the Lowell Correctional Institution in Ocala, Florida, where she has spent most of her life. The press gave her a name that has followed her ever since. They called her the offender babysitter. 3 plain words that capture both the ordinary role she filled and the horror she carried inside it. What lingers about Christine Falling is how invisible the danger was. There was no flashing sign, no obvious threat a careful parent could have caught. There was only a willing girl, a few dollars, and a level of trust that every parent has to give somebody sooner or later. Her story is the reason this whole subject is so frightening. The danger did not break into the house. The danger was invited in, handed a baby, and left alone. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The children Christine Falling unalived passed quickly, within hours or days of being left with her. There was a terrible mercy hidden in how fast it happened, even if mercy is a strange word to use here at all. The next story does not offer even that. A baby left with a sitter in 1984 was hurt so badly that he did not pass that day or that year. He lived on for another 35 years with the damage done to him in a single afternoon, and the woman who caused it would not have to answer for his passing until nearly 4 decades had passed. Section 2. Terry McCurchy Ray and Joe Dowling were a young married couple in South Florida who did everything the way they were supposed to. They had been married 4 years when their son Benjamin was born on the 13th of January 1984. Both of them worked, the way most young couples have to, so they needed someone to watch the baby during the day. They found a local woman named Terry McCurchy, who was 22 at the time, and took children into her own home in the Hollywood area, near Fort Lauderdale. It was the ordinary arrangement of 1,000 families. 2 working parents, 1 trusted sitter, 1 baby handed over each morning and collected each evening. For the first few months of Benjamin's life, that arrangement worked the way it was meant to. He was a healthy infant. His parents went to their jobs believing he was safe and would be waiting for them fed and fine at the end of the day. That belief ended on the 3rd of July, 1984. Benjamin was 5 months old. When Ray Dowling went to pick up her son that day, she knew right away that something was terribly wrong. The baby was not himself. His little body was limp, with no strength in it at all. His tiny fists were clenched tight. His hands had a bluish colour, and he was struggling to breathe. A mother does not need a medical degree to read a sight like that. She scooped him up and rushed him to the hospital as fast as she could. At the hospital, doctors found something that no parent is ever prepared to hear. The blood vessels that fed Benjamin's brain had been torn. There was serious hemorrhaging inside his head. The doctors who looked at the injuries reached a clear conclusion. The damage had been caused by aggressive shaking. A 5-month-old baby cannot do that to himself. Someone had done it to him. There was only one person who had been alone with Benjamin that day. Terry McCurchy gave the police her own version of events. She told them the baby had fallen off a couch and hit his head. A fall from a couch, though, does not tear the blood vessels in an infant's brain. The doctors knew the difference between an accidental bump and the kind of force that had been used on this child. Within days, McCurchy was arrested. She was charged with attempted homicide and with aggravated child mistreatment, which is the legal term for harming a child in a severe way. What happened next is one of the parts of this story that still makes people angry decades later. At the time of her arrest, McCurchy was 6 months pregnant with her 3rd child. She was facing the real possibility of 12 to 17 years behind bars. Instead, in 1985, she was offered a deal. She pleaded no contest to the charges, which is a way of accepting punishment without actually admitting that you did anything wrong. And the punishment she received was almost nothing. She was sentenced to spend her weekends in jail, and only until she gave birth to her baby. That came out to roughly 60 days, served on weekends, so that her ordinary life could continue around it. After she had her child, she was set free and placed on probation for 3 years, which simply meant she had to check in and stay out of trouble. A woman who had shaken an infant so hard that his brain hemorrhaged, leaving him broken for life, walked out of that courtroom and went home to her own children. The Dowlings were stunned. According to what they later told reporters, they were told about the plea deal only minutes before the court hearing where it was finalized. They had no real chance to argue against it. One of the prosecutors involved described the light sentence using the word therapeutic and never explained what that was supposed to mean. The public defender on McCurchy's side called the sentence fair, given the circumstances. The exact reasons behind such a soft outcome were never made clear to the family. Some legal observers later guessed that the evidence available in 1985 might have been weaker than it seemed, or that key witnesses might not have been ready. None of that guessing brought any comfort to the parents, who had to drive home with a child who would never be the same. For her part, McCurchy kept saying she was innocent. She told reporters that her conscience was clear, that she knew she had not done it, and that she only took the deal because she wanted to put the whole thing behind her and be with her children. She would hold to that story for the next 40 years. Benjamin Dowling, meanwhile, began a life that no one would ever choose. The injury from that single afternoon did not unalive him. It did something that some might call worse. It locked him inside a body and a mind that could barely function, and then it left him there for the next 35 years. He never crawled. He never fully rolled over on his own. He never walked. He never spoke a single word. He never learned to feed himself, and he spent his entire life in a wheelchair, depending on others for every small thing a person needs. he never got to taste the simple pleasures of a normal childhood. His mother would later describe the heartbreaking smallness of what he was denied. He never enjoyed a hamburger. He never had an ice cream cone on a hot day. He could not tell his parents when something hurt, or when he had an itch he wanted scratched. The ordinary language between a child and a parent, the pointing and the asking and the complaining, was taken from all of them. The Dowlings cared for their son through all of it. Year after year, they fed him, moved him, comforted him, and loved him, watching him grow into a grown man's body while his mind stayed locked away. 35 years is longer than many marriages, longer than many careers. It was the length of Benjamin's whole life, and every day of it carried the weight of what had been done to him before he could even sit up by himself. In 2019, at the age of 35, Benjamin Dowling passed. By then, he had been living in Manatee County, on the other side of Florida. After his passing, a doctor whose job is to study how people pass examined his body and reviewed his history. That doctor reached a conclusion that would reopen a wound the family had carried for decades. Benjamin had not simply passed of natural causes. He had passed from the injuries he suffered as a 5-month-old baby. The brain damage that began on that July day in 1984 had, in the end, unalived him. The doctor reported the matter to law enforcement. That single medical finding changed everything. If the original injury had caused his passing, then the passing was a homicide, and the person responsible could be charged for it, even all these years later. A grand jury in Broward County looked at the case and formally charged Terry McCurchie with first-degree homicide. By that point, she was 59 years old, living a quiet life near the city of Sugar Land in Texas. The light sentence she had received in 1985 was supposed to be the end of her story with the Dowling family. Now, 37 years after she shook their baby, she was facing the possibility of spending the rest of her life in prison. She was held in jail in Texas while arrangements were made to bring her back to Florida to answer the new charge. The case did not move quickly. It took about 3 years from the charge to its conclusion. McCurchie's lawyers needed time to do their own investigation, and both sides had to work out what would happen next. The science of how a long-ago injury connects to a much later passing can be complicated to argue in a courtroom, and the lawyers on both sides had a great deal to sort through. As the case neared its end, McCurchie made a quiet choice. In May, before everything was final, she voluntarily walked into the Broward County Jail to begin serving time, a sign that a deal was close. On the 21st of August, 2024, Terry McCurchie stood before a Broward County judge named George Odom Jr. She was 62 years old by then, dressed in a red jail jumpsuit, her wrists and ankles in shackles. She was described as stoic, showing almost no feeling as the hearing went on around her. The courtroom was full of people who had loved Benjamin, and some of them wept as the painful details were laid out. The deal that ended the case was this. McCurchie pleaded guilty to manslaughter, which is the legal name for causing a passing without the level of cold planning that defines homicide. The first-degree homicide charge, with its threat of life in prison, was set aside in exchange for that guilty plea. Her sentence was 3 years in prison, followed by 10 years of probation once she got out. The prosecutor handling the case explained that both sides agreed to the deal, partly because the case was so emotionally heavy for everyone involved, and the science of the decades-old injury made a trial uncertain. As part of the agreement, McCurchie was finally required to do the one thing she had refused to do for 40 years. She had to tell the truth about what happened. After 4 decades of insisting she was innocent, After a no-contest plea that admitted nothing, she at last gave an account of the day she hurt Benjamin Dowling. Her words came in the form of a letter, which her lawyer, an assistant public defender named David Fry, read aloud in the courtroom. In it, she apologized to Benjamin's parents. She wrote that she had been overwhelmed and worn out from caring for several children at once, and that when Benjamin and the other children were crying, she struck him in a moment of anger and lost control. She said she hoped her words might give the family some small measure of peace. After a lifetime of denial, that letter was the closest thing to the truth the Dowlings had ever received from her. Outside the weight of those words, the parents who had spent 35 years caring for their broken son finally heard the woman responsible admit what she had done. Ray Dowling said simply that McCurchy would have to live with it. Joe Dowling said the family just had to stay strong and keep moving forward. They were glad to hear the admission, but they were honest about its limits. Nothing said in that courtroom could bring Benjamin back. Nothing could give him the life he should have had. The words he never spoke, the steps he never took, the ice cream he never tasted. There is something especially heavy about a passing that takes 40 years to finish happening. Most crimes have a clear before and after. A person is here, and then they are gone, and the harm is done in an instant. Benjamin's story stretched the harm across an entire human lifetime. The crime began in 1984, and it did not truly end until 2019, and the law did not catch up with it until 2024. For 4 decades, the consequences of one overwhelmed afternoon kept unfolding in a wheelchair, in a quiet home, in the tired and loving hands of 2 parents who never got the child they were meant to raise. The case also says something uncomfortable about how easy it once was for such harm to be brushed aside. In 1985, a young woman shook a baby into a lifetime of disability and was sentenced to weekends in jail. The system that was supposed to protect that child treated the matter as something to be tidied up and forgotten. It took the child's own passing, 35 years on, to force the courts to look at the case with the seriousness it always deserved. Justice did arrive in the end, but it walked so slowly that the victim did not live to see it, and the punishment, even then, came out to 3 years for a life that was stolen, one piece at a time. What makes McCurchy's story land so hard is the gap between the size of the harm and the smallness of the reckoning. A whole life, lived in silence and dependence, traced back to a few seconds of an adult's fury at a crying infant. And a woman who carried that secret, by her own eventual account, for 40 years before a single sentence of truth was read on her behalf in a courtroom. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Dowling case unfolded almost entirely out of public view. It was a private grief, carried by one family in their own home, until a passing certificate dragged it into a courtroom decades later. The next story is the complete opposite. A baby would pass in the care of a young sitter, and instead of staying quiet and local, the case would explode across television screens on 2 continents. Whole countries would pick sides. Crowds would gather outside the courthouse, and at the centre of the storm would sit a teenage girl from England, far from home, accused of unaliving the infant she had been hired to love. Section 3. Louise Woodward. Louise Woodward was a teenager from a small English village called Elton when she came to the United States to work as an au pair. An au pair is a young person, usually from another country, who lives with a family and helps care for their children in exchange for room, board, and a little pay. For many young people, it is a chance to see the world for a year before settling into the rest of their lives. Louise was just 18, far from home, living under the roof of a family she had only recently met, in a country that was not her own. The family she went to work for were the Eappens, who lived in Newton, Massachusetts, a comfortable town near Boston. Sunil and Deborah Eapen were both doctors with busy careers and 2 small sons. The younger of the 2 boys was a baby named Matthew, who was 8 months old. Like so many working parents before them, the Eappens needed someone to help with their children during the day, and so they brought Louise into their home to do it. The arrangement followed the same simple pattern as countless others: trusting parents, a young caregiver, and 2 little boys who needed looking after. Everything changed on the 4th of February, 1997. On that day, Louise Woodward called for an ambulance. She told the emergency operator that baby Matthew was barely breathing. The call set off a desperate rush to save the infant's life. At the hospital, doctors found injuries that frightened them. Matthew had a crack in his skull. There was hemorrhaging inside his head, pressing on his brain. They also discovered an older injury to his wrist that no one had noticed before. To the doctors who examined him, this did not look like an ordinary accident. The pattern of harm suggested to them that the baby had been shaken with great force and that his head had struck something hard. For 5 days, Matthew Eapen clung to life. On the 9th of February 1997, he passed. When a baby passes with injuries like that, suspicion falls on whoever was caring for him. Louise had been the one alone with Matthew. She was arrested and charged, and the charge was the most serious one possible. She was accused of homicide. A teenage girl who had crossed an ocean for a year abroad was suddenly sitting in an American jail, facing the rest of her life behind bars. What followed became one of the most watched trials of its time. The case did not stay quiet inside a Massachusetts courtroom. It spilled out onto television screens in the United States and across the ocean in Britain, and it turned into something far bigger than a single tragedy. 2 whole countries seemed to take sides. In America, many people saw a lifeless baby and a caregiver who should answer for it. In Britain, many people saw one of their own, a young girl far from home being crushed by a foreign justice system that they did not trust. In her tiny village of Elton, neighbours gathered and prayed and insisted she could never have done such a thing. Crowds followed every twist of the case. The trial also became a stage for a larger argument that had nothing to do with Louise herself. People began debating whether mothers should go back to work at all when their children were small, or whether they should stay home if they could afford to. The Eappens, 2 working doctors, found their private choices picked apart by strangers. A family's worst nightmare had become a public talking point. Inside the courtroom, the 2 sides told very different stories about how Matthew passed. The prosecution argued that Louise had grown frustrated with the baby and had shaken him aggressively and slammed his head against a hard surface, causing the deadly injuries. Their case rested on the idea that a healthy infant had been hurt badly and recently, and that the young woman in the room was the only one who could have done it. The defense told a different story, and they had serious legal talent behind them. Louise's lead lawyer was Barry Scheck, a famous attorney who helped start a group known for using science to free people who had been wrongly convicted. Her defense was paid for by the au pair company that had placed her. Scheck and his team argued that Matthew had an older injury inside his head, one that had been there for weeks, and that this old injury suddenly began to hemorrhage again. In their telling, the baby's passing was a medical tragedy that Louise did not cause. They pointed to her youth and her lack of training, and they argued there was no proof she had acted with the cruelty the prosecution described. Then, the defense made a bold and risky choice that would shape everything that came after. In American courts, a jury can sometimes be given the option to convict a person of a lesser crime if they are not sure about the most serious one. Louise's lawyers ask the judge to take that option away. They ask that the jury be allowed to consider only homicide, the most serious charge, and not the lesser crime of manslaughter, which covers causing a passing without meaning to. Their bet was simple. If the jury had only two choices, homicide or nothing, they hoped the jurors would decide that homicide was too strong and would let her walk free entirely. The judge agreed to their request. It was a high-stakes gamble, and the whole case now balanced on it. The gamble failed. On the 30th of October 1997, the jury returned its verdict. They found Louise Woodward guilty of second-degree homicide, which means unaliving someone without planning it in advance. In the courtroom, Louise broke down. She cried out that she had not done anything, asking why they had done this to her. The conviction carried a punishment fixed by law. The very next day, she was sentenced to life in prison, with no chance of even asking for release for 15 years. The teenager from Elton had been handed the worst possible outcome. For 10 days, that was where things stood. A young woman convicted of homicide, facing a life behind bars in a foreign country. And then the judge did something that stunned everyone. The judge in the case was named Hilla Zobel. In American law, a judge has the power, in rare situations, to step in and change a jury's verdict if the judge believes the result was a serious mistake. On the 10th of November 1997, Judge Zobel used that power. He decided that calling what Louise did homicide was wrong. He reduced her conviction from second-degree homicide down to involuntary manslaughter, the lesser crime of causing a passing without intending to. In his written decision, he said he was morally certain that letting the homicide conviction stand would be a great injustice. He described Louise as having acted out of confusion, inexperience, frustration and immaturity, with perhaps some anger, but without the evil intent that homicide requires. Having lowered the charge, the judge then dealt with her punishment. Louise had already spent 279 days locked up, counting the time before and during her trial. Judge Zobel sentenced her to exactly that, the time she had already served. In a single afternoon, she went from a life sentence for homicide to being a free woman. She walked out of custody. The reaction on both sides of the ocean was enormous and split right down the middle. In England, in her home village and far beyond it, people cheered. Crowds celebrated outside pubs and in the streets, certain that justice had finally been done for a wronged girl. In Massachusetts, the feeling was very different. Matthew's mother, Deborah Eapen, spoke about her grief and anger, saying in plain terms that Louise had taken away their son, and that the judge had then taken away justice. To the family who had buried an 8-month-old baby, watching his caregiver go free felt like a second wound. The legal fight was not finished. The prosecution wanted the homicide conviction brought back, or at least a longer sentence. The defense also kept fighting. The case climbed up to the highest court in Massachusetts. On the 16th of June 1998, that court gave its answer. By a narrow margin, with the judges divided, it upheld the lower decision. The manslaughter conviction stood, and so did the sentence of time already served. The court was careful to point out one thing that often got lost in the celebration. Louise had not been found innocent. She had been found guilty of manslaughter. The court had simply agreed that the punishment would end at the time she had already spent locked up. Within hours of that ruling, Matthew's father filed a lawsuit seeking to hold her responsible in a different way, through the civil courts rather than the criminal ones. Free at last to leave the country, Louise returned home to England in June 1998. But the question that had divided two nations never truly got a clean answer. and that is what keeps the case alive in people's minds even now. Part of the reason lies in the science itself. The whole prosecution rested on the belief that shaking a baby aggressively, sometimes combined with an impact, can cause exactly the kind of brain injuries Matthew had. At the time, that idea was widely accepted in medicine and in courtrooms. In the years since, though, a number of doctors and experts have questioned how certain anyone can really be in cases like this. Some have argued that the injuries blamed on shaking can sometimes come from other causes, including older injuries or natural medical problems. A television program that looked into the case even featured a respected doctor who suggested that both the prosecution and the defense had gotten the cause of passing wrong. The point is not that the doubts prove Louise innocent. The point is that the certainty everyone felt at the time has softened, and what once looked like settled science now carries real questions. Louise herself has always insisted she did not unalive Matthew. In one television interview after her release, she admitted that she had shaken the baby lightly when she found him unconscious, saying she was trying to bring him back to life rather than harm him. She acknowledged she may not always have been as gentle with him as she could have been. Beyond that, she has held firmly to her claim of innocence for the rest of her life. And she did go on to have a rest of her life, which is something Matthew Eapen never got. After returning to England, Louise eventually stepped away from the public eye. She studied, she became a dance teacher, she married, and years later, she had a daughter of her own. She built an ordinary, quiet life in the English countryside, the kind of life that a young woman setting off for a year abroad would have imagined for herself before everything went so wrong. The Louise Woodward case is hard to file away neatly because it refuses to give the kind of clean ending people crave. A baby is lifeless, and that fact never changes. A young woman was convicted of causing that passing, and that fact never changes either. Yet whether she did it on purpose, whether she did it at all, and whether the science used against her was sound, all of that remains tangled in doubt and argument decades later. Some people will always see a guilty offender who got off lightly. Others will always see an inexperienced teenager wrongly blamed for a medical tragedy. The courts split. The countries split. Families and strangers split. The one thing everyone shares is the absence of certainty. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That uncertainty is exactly what sets the next case apart so sharply. Louise Woodward walked free in large part because no one could say for sure what happened behind that closed door, because the experts disagreed and the doubt could not be erased. In the story that comes next, there was no room for any of that. There were no warring doctors and no mystery about who did what, because this time a camera was running, and it recorded everything. Section 4. Oluremi Oyindasola Nikia Porter and Influence Salubi did everything a careful parent is supposed to do. When they needed someone to help care for their 3 children, they did not just grab the first person who answered an ad. They interviewed people. They asked around and collected recommendations from people they trusted. The woman they finally chose came highly recommended by their own friends, people they had no reason to doubt. Her name was Oluremi Oyindasola, and she was a live-in nanny, meaning she stayed in the family home and looked after the children day to day. She was in her late 60s, originally from Nigeria, an older woman with the kind of experience that makes nervous parents feel a little safer. The family lived in Glenarden, a quiet community in Prince George's County, Maryland. Among their 3 children was a baby girl named Anita Salubi, who was 8 months old. She was at the age where babies start to explore the world around them, pulling at things, reaching for people, making their wants known in the only ways they can. Like many families, The Salubis had set up a small camera in their home so they could keep an eye on things. It was an ordinary precaution, the kind countless parents take. None of them could have known that the camera would one day become the only witness to the worst thing that ever happened in that house. In October 2016, on a day that should have been like any other, the camera was recording in the living room. The footage tells the story in plain, undeniable images. Little Anita was in her baby walker, the kind of frame on wheels that lets an infant scoot around a room before she can walk on her own. She moved about the living room, busy in the way babies are. Across the room, the nanny had lain down on the couch and fallen asleep. At some point, Anita grew fussy and wanted attention. She rolled herself over to the couch. She tugged at the nanny's dress. She patted and pulled at the woman's leg, crying, doing exactly what a baby does when she needs something and the grown-up nearby is not responding. What happened after the nanny woke up is the part that no parent should ever have to see. Oyindasola got up from the couch. At first, she tried to feed the baby in the normal way, but the feeding did not go smoothly. Then she did something that turned an ordinary moment into an unaliving. She took a bottle, removed the nipple from the top, and began pouring the milk straight down the baby's throat. She poured around 8 ounces of milk into the child's mouth in less than 30 seconds. For a tiny infant, that is an impossible amount to swallow that fast. The milk filled the baby's airway. In simple terms, the nanny was submerging Anita in her own bottle. The camera caught the baby's body reacting the way anybody would. Anita squirmed. She struggled. She tried to resist the flood of milk being forced into her. At one point, she fell to the ground. And then, with the first bottle empty, the nanny picked her back up and reached for a second bottle, forcing more milk into the child who could no longer protect herself. The little girl went limp. What the nanny did next made the whole thing even harder to understand. Once the baby had gone still, Oyindasola began to rock her. She wiped the child's face. She seemed to be trying to bring her back, holding the small, limp body and rocking it for several minutes. But the help that mattered most, call for real medical aid, did not come right away. The nanny waited about 20 minutes before she finally picked up the phone, and the first person she called was not an ambulance. It was the baby's father. Influence Salubi was at work when his phone rang and the nanny told him something was wrong with his daughter. As he raced home, he called for emergency help. By the time he reached the house, the worst had already happened. He found his baby girl lifeless, her little feet already gone cold. Anita was rushed to the University of Maryland Prince George's Hospital Center, but there was nothing the doctors could do. She was pronounced lifeless. The doctors who later examined her determined that she had passed from asphyxiation. The milk that had been forced into her had cut off her ability to breathe. When a baby passes suddenly in someone's care, there is often a painful gap between what a caregiver claims and what truly happened. Many of the cases that fill these stories turn on that gap, on the doubt about whether anyone can really know what went on behind a closed door. This case was different in one enormous way. The door had a camera behind it. There was no need to guess, no need for dueling experts arguing over invisible injuries, no need to weigh one person's word against another's. The whole thing had been recorded from start to finish. That recording took away every excuse. When the case went forward, Oyindasola offered her own explanation for what the video showed. She claimed she had only been cup-feeding the baby, a normal way of giving a child milk. The people who watched the footage saw something else entirely. Prosecutors said plainly that she had force-fed the child, that she had done it to make the crying baby stop bothering her after the little girl had woken her from her nap. The local prosecutor, Aisha Braveboy, described it in human terms that anyone could follow. The nanny was tired and irritated. The baby kept pulling at her, and the woman wanted the child to be quiet. Any caregiver, Braveboy pointed out, should have understood that pouring that much milk into an infant that fast would cause terrible harm, or passing. The strength of the video evidence shaped the way the case was handled. Oyindamola chose not to have a jury hear her case. Instead, she asked for a trial in front of a judge alone, who would look at the evidence and decide her fate. Given what the camera had captured, it is hard to imagine the outcome going any other way. In February 2019, the judge found her guilty. She was convicted of second-degree homicide, which is unaliving someone without planning it ahead of time, along with 2 charges of child mistreatment, including the most serious form, child mistreatment that results in passing. By then, the woman, who had been in her late 60s at the time of the unaliving, was 73 years old. She faced the possibility of spending up to 70 years behind bars, which, at her age, would have meant the rest of her life many times over. In May 2019, the judge handed down her sentence. He ordered a term of 40 years, but set most of it aside, leaving her to actually serve 15 years in prison, to be followed by 5 years of supervision once she got out. For a woman in her 70s, 15 years is a sentence that may well stretch to the end of her life. For the family, no number of years could ever balance the scale. The father, Influence Salubi, stood in court and spoke about the loss in the kind of language that needs no explaining. He talked about the unbearable strangeness of leaving home with a living baby and returning to find that baby lifeless. It was, he said, something he could never forget. Behind those words sat a grief that the legal system has no power to fix. The Salubis had been careful. They had done the research, asked the questions, checked the references, and brought into their home someone their own friends had vouched for. They had taken every reasonable step a loving family could take, and it still was not enough to save Anita. That is one of the most unsettling truths buried inside this case. The danger did not come from carelessness on the part of the parents. They were responsible people who followed all the right steps. The danger came from a person who passed every test, who looked safe on paper and in person, and who then did something monstrous in a single moment of irritation. There was no way for the family to have seen it coming, because nothing about the woman they hired gave a warning. The only thing that revealed the truth was a small camera mounted on a wall, recording quietly while everyone else was away. There is also the matter of the 20 minutes. After the baby went limp, Oyindamola spent those minutes rocking her, wiping her face, trying in some way to undo what she had just done, before calling for help. Those minutes may have been the difference between a chance at survival and no chance at all. They speak to a person who understood, in the moment after, that something had gone horribly wrong, and who still did not move quickly to get the child the emergency care she needed. By the time real help was on the way, the time for saving Anita had already slipped past. The camera in that living room changed everything about how this case ended. In so many of these stories, families are left with questions that never get answered, with a verdict that feels uncertain, with the lingering possibility that the truth passed with the victim. The Salubi family was spared at least that particular torment. They did not have to wonder. They could see exactly what had happened to their daughter, frame by frame. It is a severe kind of clarity, the sort no parent should ever possess. But it gave them something many grieving families never receive. It gave them certainty, and it gave the court a record so plain that no clever argument could explain it away. In a strange and painful way, the very thing that made this case so horrifying also made justice possible. The recording that showed a helpless baby being submerged in her own bottle was the same recording that guaranteed the woman responsible would be held accountable. The camera could not save Anita. It could only bear witness. But its witness was enough to put the truth beyond all doubt. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The story of Oluremi Oyindasola shows what happens when a crime is captured directly, when the proof is right there on the screen for a judge to watch. The evidence sat inside a device the family had placed in their own home. The next case turns that idea in a darker direction. The proof that exposed the next babysitter did not come from a camera the parents had set up to protect their child. It came from inside the sitter's own phone, hidden in the things she had typed into a search bar when she thought no one would ever look. And what she searched for revealed a mind that had been turning toward harm before the little girl in her care ever passed. Section 5. Christy Flood. The danger in this story did not arrive as a stranger. It came wrapped in friendship, in the kind of trust that takes years to build and feels completely safe right up until the moment it shatters. Kristin Fridley had known Christy Flood for about 5 years. They were close. Flood was the sort of friend a busy mother could lean on, someone who seemed to adore children and was always glad to help out. So when Kristin needed someone to watch her little daughter, Fallon, while she went to work, the choice felt natural. Starting in the summer of 2020, Flood began babysitting 2-year-old Fallon on a regular basis. There were no warning bells loud enough to stop a mother from handing her toddler to a friend she had known for half a decade. Friends who watch your kids are supposed to be the safe option, the people you choose precisely because you already know and love them. Fallon was just 2 years old, a little girl from Smyrna, Georgia, with her whole life still ahead of her. Her days with Flood were meant to be ordinary, the kind of cared-for hours a working mother arranges so she can earn a living and still come home to her child each evening. On the 9th of December 2020, that ordinary arrangement ended in the worst way possible. A call came in to the Sandy Springs Police Department, north of Atlanta, reporting an unresponsive child at an apartment on Monterey Parkway. The apartment was Flood's home. Police and emergency crews rushed to the scene. They found little Fallon and began trying to save her, giving her the kind of life-saving help that doctors and medics give a child whose body has stopped working. She was taken quickly to the hospital. Despite everything they tried, Fallon could not be saved. The 2-year-old was pronounced lifeless. The first explanation for her passing came from Flood herself, and it was the kind of story that on its surface sounds like a terrible accident. Flood told the police that Fallon had hit her head on a playground slide and then simply would not wake up. It is the sort of thing that does happen to small children: a fall, a bump, a scare. For a moment, it might have passed as a tragedy with no villain. The story fell apart almost immediately. The doctors who treated Fallon and the medical examination of her body after she passed told a very different tale. Her injuries were far too severe to have come from a fall against playground equipment. She had not bumped her head. She had been severely harmed. Investigators determined that the little girl passed from massive trauma, the kind of damage caused by aggression rather than an accident. The slide story was a lie, told to cover up something monstrous. Once the police knew the passing was no accident, they began digging into the life and the devices of the woman who had been alone with Fallon. And it was inside Flood's own phone that they found the part of this case that is almost impossible to read without a chill running down the spine. Investigators looked through the searches Flood had typed into her phone. People type the most private things into search engines, the questions they would never say out loud, the thoughts they assume no one will ever see. What Flood had searched for revealed a mind that had been circling something dark. She had typed in a question asking, What kind of people enjoy mistreating other people's children? She had typed in another question, asking what it means to feel a sudden urge to harm a child who is not your own. Those searches change the whole shape of this case. A person who lashes out once in a single terrible moment is one thing. A person who sits with their phone and types out questions about the urge to hurt a child, who is searching for an explanation of the very feelings rising inside them, is something else. The searches show a person who was aware, on some level, of what was happening in her own head, who was looking at her own dangerous impulses and trying to make sense of them, all while continuing to take a trusting friend's toddler into her care. The danger was building, and it left a trail in the one place she thought no one would look. The full truth of what Fallon suffered turned out to be even worse than a single harming. Investigators and prosecutors came to understand that the mistreatment had not been a one-time event. Over a stretch of time, while Fallon's mother was away at work, believing her daughter was safe, the little girl was being hurt in that apartment. The big break that revealed how bad it truly was came months into the investigation, when prosecutors discovered video that captured much of the mistreatment playing out inside the home. The recording showed what words alone could never fully convey. The lead prosecutor on the case, the district attorney, later said that in all her years, she could count on one hand the defendants she would call truly evil, and that the torment this child endured left her no other word to use. The charges against Flood reflected the full horror of what she had done. When the case reached its end, she pleaded guilty to homicide, including the most serious kind that the law recognizes, the kind committed with cruel intent. She pleaded guilty to cruelty to children. She admitted to lying to the police and to trying to cover up the evidence of her crime. And she pleaded guilty to a serious mistreatment charge against the child, a detail so dark that it is hard to even hold in the mind. The little girl had been failed and harmed in nearly every way a helpless child can be. There was a second person in that apartment who shares the blame. Flood's boyfriend, Jeffrey Myers, was also there. According to the case against him, he stood by and watched the mistreatment happen and did nothing to stop it. He did not call for help. He did not protect the child. He simply allowed it to unfold. Myers was arrested in early January 2021, a few weeks after Fallon's passing. He later pleaded guilty to second-degree homicide for his role in allowing the unaliving to happen. His silence and his inaction made him part of the crime. What makes Flood's story so disturbing is how well hidden she was. To the people around her, she did not look like a danger. She had told friends and family that she loved children, and after her arrest, some of those friends spoke up to defend her, insisting that children were her whole world. Fallon's own mother had trusted her for years, had handed her daughter into those hands again and again, never seeing the threat. After it all came out, the heartbroken mother described the feeling of looking back and realizing that something evil had been standing right in front of her for years, in the form of a close friend, and she had never once seen it. She spoke about how the homicide of her daughter upended everything she thought she understood about people and about the world. That sense of betrayal sits at the heart of this case. Many of the dangerous caregivers in these stories were strangers or near strangers, people hired through an agency or found through an ad, people the family barely knew. Flood was the opposite. She was a chosen friend, vetted by years of shared life rather than by a background check. The mother did not skip any reasonable step. She trusted someone she had every reason to trust. The lesson buried in that fact is a hard one, because it suggests that even the most careful judgment can be fooled by a person determined to hide what they are. Flood, it later emerged, was not a stranger to trouble. She had a history that included prior arrests, among them charges related to aggression. In the months before Fallon's passing, there had been a string of incident reports connected to her name, covering various kinds of trouble. The picture that formed after the fact was of a person whose life was unraveling in ways that, looked at altogether, painted a worrying portrait. But scattered across time and seen only in pieces, none of it had been enough to pull a beloved little girl out of harm's way before it was too late. The legal end came in March 2024, more than 3 years after Fallon passed. In a courtroom in Fulton County, Georgia, Christy Flood pleaded guilty to the long list of charges against her. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She will never be released. She will grow old and pass behind bars, which is the most that the justice system can do in a case where the victim was a defenseless 2-year-old. Her boyfriend received 15 years for standing by while it happened. The officials who handled the case spoke afterward about how deeply it had affected them. So many people in the police department and the prosecutor's office had a hand in investigating and building the case that it became personal for them. The district attorney said the homicide changed the way her office approaches the passing of any child, reshaping how investigators work with police at the scene when a child has passed. A crime this terrible left marks not only on the family, but on the system meant to deliver justice for children. The phone searches remain the detail that lingers longest. There is something uniquely chilling about a person quietly typing their darkest impulses into a search bar, looking for words to describe the urge to hurt a child while the child sleeps or plays nearby. It is a window into a mind in the moments before a tragedy, a glimpse of the danger forming in real time. Cameras can show what a person did. The search history showed something closer to what a person was thinking. The private storm gathering behind an ordinary face that a loving mother had trusted for years. Fallon Fridley deserved a long life full of birthdays and scraped knees and ordinary mornings. Instead, she was failed by the friend her mother chose to protect her, and harmed beyond what most people can bear to imagine. The justice that came years later cannot give back a single day of the life she should have had. It can only make sure that the woman who took it from her never walks free again. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Flood reached for a lie to hide what she had done, blaming a playground slide for injuries that came from her own hands. That move, the desperate cover story meant to turn a homicide into an accident, shows up again in the case that comes next. Another babysitter would stand before a frightened mother and offer an explanation for why her little boy was so sick. She would not blame a slide. She would blame a bar of soap. And the truth behind that strange little lie was a head injury severe enough to end a child's life. Section 6. Kimora Hodges. The lie at the center of this story is almost strange in how small it sounds. A bar of soap. That was the explanation a young babysitter gave for why a nearly 2-year-old boy was slipping toward passing. The truth behind the lie was about as far from a bar of soap as it is possible to get. Taylor Starks was a young mother trying to build a steady life for herself and her little boy, Kyrie. In March of 2022, she moved into an apartment complex on Little Mac Avenue in Roseville, Michigan, a community just north of Detroit. Living in the same building was a woman named Kimora Hodges, who was around 21 at the time. Hodges had a young daughter of her own, a little girl about the same age as Kyrie. The two mothers grew close. They were neighbors and friends, the kind of bond that forms quickly when you have small children the same age and you live just a short walk apart. That closeness made the arrangement that followed feel completely natural. When Taylor needed someone to watch Kyrie while she went to work, Hodges was right there, a friend with a toddler of her own, someone Taylor came to trust. For about 2 months, Hodges looked after Kyrie regularly. Taylor would head off to her job, believing her son was safe with a neighbor she liked, in a home full of toys and a playmate close to his age. She later said she would have done anything for Hodges and her little girl. That is how deep the trust ran. Kyrie was a bright, lively little boy, just shy of his 2nd birthday. His mother spoke about him with the pride that comes naturally to a parent of a clever toddler. He was barely more than a baby, and he already knew how to count to 5. He was at that wonderful age where the world is brand new and every small thing is a discovery. On the night of the 13th of June 2022, Kyrie was in Hodges' care. What should have been another ordinary evening became the night his life was taken from him. In the early hours of the next morning, Hodges reached out to Taylor. The message was not an alarm. It was almost casual. Hodges contacted the mother about the way Kyrie was sleeping, as though something seemed a little off about how the boy was resting. There was no scream of emergency in those first words, no clear sign that anything terrible had happened. To a mother reading a message about her son's odd sleep, it might have sounded like a small worry, the kind that turns out to be nothing. Taylor did not waste time. She came quickly, arriving within minutes. And what she found was nothing like a sleeping child. Kyrie was on the ground, and his small body was caught in seizure after seizure after seizure, one convulsion rolling into the next. A boy who had been counting to 5 and playing was now shaking uncontrollably, his body in crisis. Taylor called for emergency help right away. When she asked what had happened, Hodges gave her the soap story. She told Taylor, and reportedly told other people too, that Kyrie had eaten soap and was having some kind of allergic reaction to it. It was an explanation that pointed away from any wrongdoing, an accident with a household item, the sort of thing that could happen to any curious toddler who put the wrong thing in his mouth. In that frantic moment, with her son convulsing and an ambulance on the way, Taylor believed her. There was no reason in her mind to doubt a trusted friend. People who love and trust someone do not leap to the darkest possible conclusion, especially in the middle of an emergency when all their focus is on saving their child. So Taylor held on to the soap story because it came from a friend, and because the alternative had not yet entered her mind. The belief lasted only until the doctors got a good look at Kyrie. At the hospital, the medical staff began to explain the true extent of his injuries, and the soap story collapsed under the weight of what they were seeing. Kyrie had suffered blunt force trauma to his head, the kind of damage that comes from severe physical force. He was hemorrhaging from his ears. Inside his skull, there was hemorrhaging around his brain, and there was hemorrhaging in the backs of both of his eyes, a pattern doctors recognize as a sign of aggressive harm to a small child. His injuries were so grave that he needed emergency brain surgery right away. None of that comes from swallowing soap. A toddler does not hemorrhage from the ears and need his skull opened because of an allergic reaction. The truth was written all over his tiny body. What investigators came to understand, and what Taylor would later describe, was that Kyrie had been thrown into a wall and shaken aggressively. The force used on him was the force a person uses on an enemy, not the touch anyone should ever use on a baby. And the people who examined him said that the wall and the shaking were only part of what had been done to him. Kyrie never recovered. The injuries to his brain were too severe. He had no brain activity, kept alive for a short time by machines, while his devastated mother sat beside him. And then he was gone. A boy who had been alive and counting to 5 just hours before the night of the 13th was lifeless before he ever reached his 2nd birthday. Hodges was arrested. At first, she faced a charge of first-degree child mistreatment, the most serious mistreatment charge. Once Kyrie passed, the case became a homicide case, and prosecutors added a homicide charge that applies when a passing happens during the course of another serious crime. She was held in jail without the chance to pay her way out. When detectives questioned her, Hodges gave answers that revealed a person caught between admitting and denying. She acknowledged that she had inflicted the injuries that unalived Kyrie. At the same time, she fought against the way the police framed it. She told them, in her own tangled words, that this was not what was supposed to happen. She pushed back against the idea that she had taken her anger out on the boy, insisting that was not what it was. And then, in the same breath, she offered something close to a confession, wrapped inside an excuse. She said that maybe she had hit him too hard, while still denying that she had unleashed her anger on him. Those words capture something disturbing about her state of mind. A person willing to admit she had hurt a child fatally, yet still trying to soften and shrink what she had done, even as she said it. The path to justice in this case took years, partly because of a fight over those very statements she made to the police. Hodges' lawyers argued that some of what she told detectives should not be allowed to be used against her, because, they said, she had asked for a lawyer before she made the statements. The law is clear that once a person clearly asks for a lawyer during questioning, the police are supposed to stop and wait until that lawyer is present. The question became whether Hodges had truly made that request clearly enough. A higher court eventually sorted it out, deciding that one of her statements had to be thrown out, while another could still be used in her trial. That legal back and forth stretched the case across years, keeping a grieving family waiting for the day they would finally see a verdict. That day came in the summer of 2025. After a trial that lasted several days in a Macomb County courthouse, the jury reached its decision. They needed only a couple of hours to agree. On the 31st of July, 2025, they found Kimora Hodges guilty of homicide and of first-degree child mistreatment. The short time it took them to decide speaks to how clear the evidence had become once the soap story and the excuses were stripped away. In November of 2025, more than 3 years after Kyrie passed, Hodges stood before the judge to be sentenced. By then, she was 24 years old. The judge handed down the mandatory punishment for the homicide, life in prison without the possibility of parole, along with an additional term of 15 to 40 years for the child mistreatment. Hodges will spend the rest of her life behind bars. The prosecutor said the sentence reflected the seriousness of the crime and spoke about the system's duty to protect the most vulnerable members of society, which is exactly what a not quite 2-year-old child is. The most moving part of the whole ordeal may have been the words Kyrie's mother chose to say to the woman who unalived him. Standing in that courtroom, Taylor Starks did not pour out hatred. She told Hodges plainly that she did not carry hate in her heart, though she also said she did not believe Hodges held any real accountability for what she had done, or any of the love she had once claimed to feel for Taylor and her son. She spoke about trying to find peace and forgiveness inside herself, even in the face of something so unforgivable. For a mother to reach for forgiveness after losing her only little boy to a trusted friend is a kind of strength that most people will never be tested enough to know whether they possess. Taylor also put into words the betrayal that runs through this entire case. She had trusted Hodges completely. She had treated her like family, would have done anything for her and her daughter. And that trust was used as the cover under which her son was harmed beyond saving. Looking back, the closeness that had made the babysitting arrangement feel so safe was the very thing that left Kyrie exposed. A stranger would have been watched more carefully. A friend was simply trusted. The soap story is what makes this case stick in the mind. It is such a small, almost foolish lie, the kind of thing a person might say in a panic without thinking it through. A child ate soap and had a bad reaction. It is the lie of someone scrambling to explain away a catastrophe with the most harmless story she could grab. And the size of that lie, next to the size of the truth, tells you everything about the gap between what Hodges wanted the world to believe and what she had actually done. A boy with a hemorrhaging brain, surgery on his skull, blood in his ears and eyes, and the explanation offered was a bar of soap. There is also the cruelty of those first calm messages about how Kyrie was sleeping. While the boy lay passing from a brain injury, the woman responsible was sending a mother gentle little notes about her son resting in a funny way. That gap between the calm words and the passing child is its own kind of horror. It suggests either a person too rattled to grasp what she had done, or a person cold enough to stall for time while a toddler slipped away. Either way, the minutes that passed before Taylor was told the real urgency were minutes Kyrie did not have to spare. Kyrie Starks should be a school-age boy now, somewhere past counting to 5, learning to read and ride a bike, and argue about bedtime. Instead, his life ended in an apartment upstairs from his own home, at the hands of a friend his mother trusted, hidden for a few crucial hours behind a story about soap. The justice that arrived years later put his offender away forever. It could not give his mother back the boy who knew how to count to 5 and felt like he had been gone forever after only a week. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The babysitters in these stories so often share one move. They reach for a lie to disguise the harm, a slide, a fall, a bar of soap, anything to turn a homicide into an accident. The next case follows that same grim pattern, but it carries an added weight that sets it apart. In a home in Mississippi, a young babysitter would harm a little boy beyond saving, and when investigators looked closer, they found that the boy had not been the only small child in that house bearing the marks of someone's aggression. There had been a second victim, an infant, too young to tell anyone what had been done to her. Section 7. McCallie, Durham. Most of the cases in these stories center on a single child, one small life taken or harmed by the person trusted to protect it. This one is heavier in a way that is hard to carry, because there were 2 children in that house, 2 tiny victims under the same roof, in the hands of the same young woman. One of them did not survive. The other was a baby far too young to ever tell a soul what had been done to her. The setting was Corinth, a small town in Alcorn County, in the far northeast corner of Mississippi, about 100 miles east of Memphis. It is the kind of quiet, close community where people know their neighbors and life moves at an unhurried pace. The young woman at the heart of the case was McCallie Elizabeth Durham, who was in her mid-20s. She had been entrusted with the care of 2 very young children. One was a little boy who was 2 years old. The other was his baby sister, only 11 months old, still at the age where she could not walk or talk, still completely dependent on the grown-ups around her for every single thing. 2 children that small are a handful for anyone. A toddler and an infant together demand patience, energy, and a steady temper. The constant attention of someone who can keep calm when both are crying at once. The parents who left those 2 children with Durham were doing what parents have always had to do, finding someone to watch their kids so the household could function. They trusted her with not one, but both of their babies. The truth of what happened in that home came out on the night of the 13th of September 2022. Around 9 o'clock that evening, a call went out for help. A small child was unresponsive at a residence on County Road 380 in Corinth. Deputies from the Alcorn County Sheriff's Office, along with emergency medical workers, rushed to the home. What the deputies found when they walked in told a grim story before anyone said a word. The 2-year-old boy was unresponsive, his little body still and unmoving, and his body was covered in signs of harm. The responders saw multiple bruises and marks across his skin, the kind of injuries that do not come from a single stumble or an ordinary childhood tumble. This was a child whose body had been hurt again and again. The horror did not stop with the boy. Inside that same house was his 11-month-old sister, and she too bore the marks of aggression. The baby had multiple injuries of her own. 2 children, 1 home, both of them carrying the evidence of someone's cruelty on their small frames. Both children were rushed for medical care. They were first taken to Magnolia Regional Hospital nearby, and then transferred to Le Bonheur Children's Hospital in Memphis, a hospital that specializes in caring for the most seriously hurt and sickest children. The toddler's condition was dire. The baby girl fought for her life as well, though her injuries, as grave as they were, did not turn out to be the kind that would unalive her. As the investigation got underway, deputies looked into the babysitter who had been responsible for the children. They learned that Durham had an unrelated minor legal matter hanging over her, a small warrant from the city of Corinth. That gave them a reason to take her into custody right away, while they kept digging into what had happened to the 2 children. So she sat in the Alcorn County Jail as investigators worked to understand the full scope of what had gone on in that house on County Road 380. 2 days after the deputies first responded, on the 15th of September 2022, the news came that everyone had feared. The 2-year-old boy had passed from his injuries. He had been harmed so badly that his small body could not recover. With his passing, the case became a homicide case, and the charge against Durham rose to the most serious level the law allows. She was charged with capital homicide, the term used for the gravest kinds of unaliving, including the unaliving of a young child. In Mississippi, that charge carries the heaviest punishments on the books. In November of 2022, a grand jury, which is a group of citizens who review evidence and decide whether formal charges should move forward, handed down a 5-count set of charges against Durham, and the details in those charges revealed something that made the case even more sickening than a single terrible night. The mistreatment had not happened in one isolated moment. According to the charges, Durham had struck both children in the face or the head multiple times over the course of a 4-day period, during which the 2 of them were under her watch. This was not a single loss of control. It was days of aggression, repeated again and again, against a toddler and a baby who had no way to escape and no way to defend themselves. That 4-day span is the detail that lingers. It means there were mornings and afternoons and evenings across several days when these 2 small children were being hurt, over and over, by the person meant to be keeping them safe. It means the injuries piled up in layers, the bruises and marks accumulating across their bodies as the days passed. A child can survive a single moment of an adult's anger, even an aggressive one. Sustained mistreatment, day after day, is something else, a slow and deliberate kind of harm that gives the person inflicting it many chances to stop, to feel horror at what they are doing, to seek help. Across 4 days, those chances came and went, and the aggression continued until the little boy was harmed beyond saving. The 11-month-old sister lived. She survived her injuries and was reported to be in stable condition as she recovered in the hospital. But survival is a complicated word for a baby who has been harmed before she ever learned to speak. She came through with her life, and for that everyone was grateful. Yet she carries a beginning that no infant should ever have. She is the silent victim of this case, a baby who endured days of aggression and could not say a single word about it, who cannot remember it in any way she could ever describe, and who will grow up alongside the absence of the big brother who was taken from her. The crimes committed against her are real and serious, even though she will never be able to tell the story herself. The legal conclusion arrived more than 2 years later. On the 13th of December 2024, Macallie Durham stood in a Mississippi courtroom before Circuit Judge Michael Mills and pleaded guilty. She admitted to the capital homicide of the 2-year-old boy, and she admitted to 4 counts of serious child mistreatment connected to the ongoing harm done to both the boy and his baby sister. There would be no long trial, no drawn-out fight over the evidence. She accepted responsibility in open court for what she had done. The judge gave her the maximum the law allowed. Durham was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the homicide, and then an additional 40 years for the child mistreatment charges, with that time stacked on top of the life sentence. The prosecutors stated plainly that she will never be eligible for parole or any other form of release. She will spend the rest of her natural life behind bars. For a woman in her mid-20s, that means decades upon decades in a cell, the entire remainder of a life she still had, stretched out in front of her, traded away for 4 days of cruelty against 2 helpless children. The people who handled the case spoke about it the way professionals speak about the cases that haunt them. The sheriff's office investigated, and a team of prosecutors brought it home. These are the kinds of cases that wear on the police officers, the medical workers, and the lawyers who have to look directly at what was done to children too young to protect themselves. Everyone who touched this case had to sit with images and facts that most people are lucky enough never to encounter. What makes the Durham case stand apart in this collection is the doubling of the cruelty. So many of these stories involve one moment, one snap, one fatal mistake by a caregiver who then panics. Durham's case was different in its patience, if that word can even be used for something so monstrous. The harm stretched across days. It touched 2 children rather than 1. The bruises and marks found on the toddler's body were not the result of one strike, but of many, accumulated over time. Plain enough that the deputies who walked through the door saw them at once. This was mistreatment that had a history, a pattern, a duration. It had time to be stopped, and was not. There is also the matter of how visible it all was. The 2-year-old's body carried multiple bruises and marks. The 11-month-old showed signs of physical mistreatment as well. These were not hidden internal injuries that only a doctor could detect. These were marks on the surface, the kind that build up across days of mistreatment. That visibility raises painful questions about how such ongoing harm to 2 small children could continue across a 4-day stretch without being caught sooner. The answer in the end is the same answer that runs through so many of these cases. The children were too young to speak. The person hurting them was the very person responsible for their care. And the trust placed in that person formed a wall that kept the truth hidden until it was too late for the little boy. The justice handed down was as complete as the law could make it. A life sentence without parole plus 40 years with no path to release. By every legal measure, the system did everything it could to hold Macaulay Durham accountable. The prosecutors made certain she would never walk free, never harm another child, never know freedom again. And still, all of that legal weight cannot undo a single bruise on a single child. It cannot give the 2-year-old boy back his life, his 2nd and 3rd and 40th birthdays, the brother he might have been to the little girl who survived. It cannot erase the start of life that the baby sister was handed before she could even form a word. 2 children, 4 days. One young woman who chose aggression again and again. That is the shape of the Durham case. And it is a shape that refuses to soften, no matter how long you look at it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Every offender in these stories so far has shared one trait beyond their crimes. They were all women, trusted as nannies and babysitters in a role that society still tends to picture as female. The next case breaks that pattern entirely. It crosses the ocean to England, where the person trusted with a little girl's care was a man. One who came into a child's life through a relationship rather than a job. He carried a history that should have warned everyone around him, a temper that had already turned aggressive more than once. And when he was finally left alone in charge of a 21-month-old girl, he harmed her, lied about it, and let the hours tick by before he ever called for help. Section 8. Sean Sadler. Every offender in these stories so far has been a woman, slotted into the role of nanny or babysitter that people still tend to imagine as female. This case breaks that picture completely. The danger here was a man, and he did not arrive through a job interview or an agency or a list of references. He walked into a little girl's life through the front door of her home as the new partner of the woman raising her. To understand what happened to Lily Hanrahan, it helps to understand the loving, makeshift family she was born into. Lily came into the world in February 2016. Her mother was not able to care for the newborn herself, and so Lily's grandmother, Leslie Hanrahan, stepped in. From the time Lily was just 4 months old, her grandmother took on the job of raising her. That is its own quiet act of love, a grandmother becoming a mother all over again, so that a baby would have a safe and steady home. For Lily, this woman was her guardian and her whole world, the person who fed her, comforted her, and tucked her in at night. That home in Birmingham, England, was a place built on care. It should have been one of the safest places a child could be. The threat to it came from a person the family let in willingly, with open arms. In the early part of 2017, Lily's grandmother began a relationship with a man named Sean Sadler. He was in his early 30s. As the relationship grew, Sadler became a regular presence in the home, visiting often and frequently staying overnight. Step by step, he wove himself into the household, into the daily rhythm of a home with a toddler in it. And as he did, he took on the role of a caregiver to little Lily, a man trusted to help look after a child who was not his own. The family welcomed him. They had no way of knowing what they were welcoming, because beneath the surface, Sean Sadler carried a history that should have set off every alarm. He had 4 previous convictions for aggression, a record of attacking people that stretched back years. The first of them involved an attack on a former partner in which he struck her with a dog chain. Another involved punching a woman in the face without warning outside a social club. His court appearances stretched across 2012, 2014, and 2017. Taken together, they painted the portrait of a man with what the court would later call an uncontrollable temper, a person who reached for aggression again and again, especially against women. This was the man who became a fixture in a home with a defenseless toddler. The first signs that something was wrong with Lily began to appear in the autumn of 2017. Her grandmother started to notice bruises on the little girl's body. A loving guardian does not ignore something like that. From September of that year, she began photographing the bruises, keeping a record of them. She also alerted Lily's nursery, the place where the child spent some of her days, asking the staff there to keep an eye on her. In her own way, Lily's grandmother sensed that something was not right, and she tried to act on it. She watched, she documented, she reached out for other eyes to help her watch over the child she loved. The tragedy is that even all of that was not enough to stop what was coming. In November 2017, the worst happened. Lily, just 21 months old, was in Sadler's sole care. While she was alone with him, she suffered a sudden and devastating collapse. She was rushed to the hospital, and the doctors who received her found injuries that no toddler should ever have. She had a catastrophic head injury, the kind of brain damage that comes from terrible force. She had 6 broken ribs. Surgeons fought to save her small life, but the damage done to her was beyond what medicine could repair. Her injuries could not be survived. 3 days after she was brought in, her life support was withdrawn, and Lily passed in the life hospital. The story Sadler told about that day was a lie wrapped around an excuse. He claimed that Lily had simply fallen asleep on the sofa after watching television, and that he had called for an ambulance only when he found he could not wake her. It is the sort of harmless picture a person paints when they want a passing to look like something that just happened. A child drifting off to sleep and never waking up. The truth was that Sadler had shaken and harmed Lily with such aggression that he broke her bones and destroyed her brain. And after he did it, he did not rush to get her help. He let about 3 hours pass before seeking medical care for the gravely injured child. That delay became one of the cruelest parts of the case. A toddler with a catastrophic head injury and 6 broken ribs is a child in obvious, terrible distress. The judge who later sentenced Sadler said plainly that it must have been obvious she was seriously hurt. For 3 hours, while Lily suffered, the man responsible did nothing to save her. The judge described this as callous indifference to her suffering, a cold failure to care about the pain of the child in front of him. Those hours may well have been hours in which a faster call could have changed something. Instead, they were hours of delay, chosen by the person who had caused the harm. When the case came to trial at Birmingham Crown Court, the medical evidence stripped away every lie Sadler had told. Expert witnesses examined Lily's body and found a horrifying map of harm. There were multiple sites of injury, some recent and some already healing, which meant the aggression had been happening over time. In total, the experts counted 40 separate injuries on the small body of a 21-month-old child. 20 of those injuries were to her head and neck. The rest were spread across her body and limbs. 40 injuries is not the mark of a single moment of anger. It is the record of a child who had been hurt again and again. A pattern of mistreatment written across her skin and her bones. The court also heard that Sadler had committed an attack on Lily about a week before her passing, and that he had used trickery and deception to try to cover it up. The judge described his efforts to hide his role as shameful and cowardly. This was a man who hurt a child, schemed to conceal it, and then, when the final fatal attack came, reached for a story about a nap on the sofa. The judge called him an accomplished liar, a person skilled at deception, and noted that throughout it all, he showed no remorse for what he had done. Sadler denied homicide. He fought the charge, forcing a trial, making the family relive the worst days of their lives in a courtroom. The jury did not believe him. In March 2021, they found him guilty of unaliving Lily Hanrahan, along with a charge of seriously wounding her. 2 days later, he was sentenced. The judge imposed the mandatory life term for homicide and ordered that Sadler must serve at least 20 years before he could even be considered for release. The court heard that Lily's unaliving was the culmination of a long string of aggressive offences tied to his temper, the final and most terrible act in a life marked by attacks on others. There was a small but moving detail at the sentencing. 8 members of the jury that had convicted Sadler chose to return to court to watch him be sentenced. These were ordinary people who had sat through the evidence, who had seen the photographs and heard the medical testimony, and who felt compelled to come back and see justice handed down for a little girl they had never met. The case had marked them, the way it marks everyone who looks at it closely. After Lily's passing, an official review was carried out. the kind of formal examination that is done when a child passes from mistreatment, meant to study what happened and learn whatever lessons can be drawn to protect other children in the future. That review existed because Lily's passing raised hard questions. Here was a child whose grandmother had noticed bruises, photographed them, and warned the nursery. Here were warning signs that had been seen and acted upon, at least in part. And still, the little girl ended up lifeless at the hands of the man in her home. That is the haunting centre of this case. Lily's guardian was not careless. She had taken the child in out of love when no one else could. She had paid attention. She had spotted the bruises and tried to do something about them. And yet, none of it saved Lily. Because the danger was a man who lived in the home, who had a hidden history of aggression, and who was determined to hurt the child and to lie about it. The very intimacy that made him trusted, his place as the grandmother's partner, was what gave him the access and the cover to do what he did. The case also stands as a warning about how aggression can travel into a family. Sadler did not appear out of nowhere. He had a documented past, 4 convictions for attacking people, including a partner and a stranger. That history existed in the records of the courts. But a person beginning a new relationship does not always know the full truth of the partner they are letting into their home and their life. A charming presence at the door can hide an aggressive record behind it. By the time the danger revealed itself in bruises on a toddler, the man was already woven into the household, already a regular overnight guest, already trusted with the child alone. Lily Hanrahan had a grandmother who loved her enough to raise her from infancy and to watch over her with a careful eye. She deserved to grow up wrapped in that love, to become the child and then the woman that her grandmother dreamed of. Instead, her short life ended in a hospital bed 3 days after a man broke her body and let her suffer for hours before calling for help. The justice that followed put him away for at least 2 decades, and a courtroom full of jurors came back to witness it. None of it could give Lily back the life that the man her family trusted took from her. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Sean Sadler turned his aggression on the very child he was meant to protect, the smallest and most helpless person in the house. The next case turns the whole idea on its head. The young woman at its centre, a live-in caregiver from another country, never laid a hand on the children she was hired to mind. Her crime grew out of something else entirely, a secret romance with the man of the house, a tangled affair that ended with 2 grown adults lifeless and a plot so cold-blooded that it shocked even the seasoned people who untangled it. Section 9. Juliana Perez Magalhães. The young woman at the centre of this case never raised a hand against a child. She fed and watched over the little girl she was hired to care for, and that child came to no physical harm at her hands. The danger she became part of pointed in a completely different direction. It grew out of a secret romance, a husband who wanted his wife gone, and a plan so cold and so carefully built that it ended with 2 grown adults lifeless and an innocent stranger framed for a homicide he never committed. The household sat in Fairfax County in Northern Virginia. At its head was Brendan Banfield, a man in his late 30s who had worked as a law enforcement agent for the tax authorities, a person trained in investigation, in evidence, in how crimes are solved and how they fall apart. His wife was Christine Banfield, 37 years old, a nurse who cared for critically ill children in a hospital intensive care unit. They had a young daughter together, and to help care for that little girl, the family brought a Brazilian au pair into their home, a woman in her mid-20s named Juliana Perez Magalhães. An au pair lives with the family, sharing their home and their daily life, becoming almost a member of the household. Juliana moved into the Banfields' world in late 2022, taking up the ordinary duties of helping to mind a small child. From the outside, it looked like a normal arrangement, a busy professional couple with a young daughter and a live-in helper from overseas. What no one watching from the outside could see was the betrayal already growing inside that house. Months before Juliana ever officially became the family's au pair, Brendan Banfield had begun an affair with her. The relationship started in the summer of 2022. By the time she was living under the Banfield roof, caring for the couple's daughter, she was secretly involved with the child's married father. She shared a home with the wife while carrying on a romance with the husband, a hidden current running beneath the surface of an ordinary-looking family. The affair, on its own, would have been a private wrong, the kind of thing that breaks marriages but not the law. What turned it into something monstrous was what Brendan Banfield decided to do about his wife. According to what Juliana later told a court, Banfield made his wishes clear in the fall of 2022. He spoke about wanting to be rid of his wife. He told Juliana that he wanted to marry her and have children with her, but that his wife stood in the way. He did not want to divorce, and his reasons were as practical as they were chilling. He believed that if they divorced, his wife would end up with more money than he would. He also wanted to keep custody of his and Christine's daughter, which a divorce might threaten. In his mind, ending the marriage the normal way was off the table. So he settled on a different solution, one that would leave him free, wealthy, and with his child, without the inconvenience of a divorce. He decided his wife had to pass. The plan he built was elaborate, and it showed the mind of a man who knew how investigations work and thought he could outsmart one. Rather than simply attacking his wife and risking the obvious suspicion that falls on a husband, Banfield set out to manufacture a villain, a stranger who could take the blame. To do it, he turned to the internet. Prosecutors said he created a fake profile on an adult website, a site where people arrange private encounters. On that profile, he pretended to be his own wife, Christine. Posing as her, he began communicating with a man named Joseph Ryan. Joseph Ryan was a complete stranger to the Banfields. He was 39 years old, a man with no connection to the family, no idea who they really were, lured into a conversation he believed was with a willing woman. Through the fake profile, Banfield drew Ryan toward a planned meeting at the home, building a story that would explain why a strange man would arrive at the house. As part of the deception, Ryan was even led to bring a blade with him, an instruction that would later be twisted to make him look like an armed attacker. Ryan was being set up, walked step by step into a trap, cast as the home invader in a story that had already been written for him. The trap closed on a morning in late February 2023. When the plan was carried out, the aggression was swift and severe. Prosecutors said Brendan Banfield wounded his wife Christine beyond saving, using the very blade that Ryan had been told to bring. She was wounded 7 times in the neck, and Joseph Ryan, the stranger who had been lured into the house believing he was meeting someone, was struck. Banfield struck him, and when Ryan still showed signs of movement, still clinging to life, Juliana Perez Magalhães fired the second round, the one that unalived him. Ryan passed upstairs in a bedroom, his body bearing grievous wounds to the head and chest. A man who had done nothing to these people, who had been pulled in by a lie, lay lifeless in a house he had never been to before that day. Then came the staging. With 2 people lifeless, Banfield went to work turning the scene into the story he wanted the police to believe. He arranged things to make it look as though Ryan was the one who had wounded Christine. In a detail that captures just how cold the planning was, he transferred some of his wife's blood onto Ryan's hands, painting the lifeless stranger as her offender. The picture he was building was simple and, he hoped, convincing. A dangerous intruder had broken in and attacked Christine, and the brave husband and au pair had struck him to stop him. That was the tale they told when they called for help. Banfield and Juliana reported to the police that they had found Ryan, a stranger, wounding Christine beyond saving, and that the two of them had struck him to save her. A second emergency call described Ryan as an intruder who had attacked Christine. On its surface, it was a story of a home invasion gone tragically wrong, a family defending itself against an aggressive stranger. For a short while, it might even have held together. The trouble with a staged crime scene is that it has to survive close inspection, and this one did not. As investigators examined the physical evidence and dug into the digital trail left online, the home invasion story began to crack. The messages, the fake profile, the way the scene was arranged, the forensic details, all of it pointed away from a random intruder and towards something planned. The evidence and the story they had told did not line up. In October 2023, the plot came apart. Police arrested Juliana Perez Magalhães. During her interviews with investigators, she admitted that she had struck Joseph Ryan. She went further, giving a detailed account of what had happened, an account that matched the physical evidence and the digital records the investigators had already gathered. Her words filled in the picture that the staged scene had been built to hide. She was initially charged with second-degree homicide for Ryan's passing, a charge that reflected her direct role in firing the fatal round. What followed was a deal that would shape how the whole case ended. Juliana agreed to plead guilty to a lesser charge, manslaughter, which covers causing a passing without the full weight of planned homicide. In exchange, she agreed to cooperate with the authorities and to testify against Brendan Banfield. Her account, the prosecutors believed, was the key to unlocking the convoluted scheme for a jury. By turning on her former lover, she traded the harsher charge for the lighter one, and she became the prosecution's most important witness. Banfield's trial came in January 2026. There, Juliana took the stand and told the story from the inside. She described Banfield as the mastermind of the plot, the one who had wanted his wife gone, who had spoken of getting rid of her, who had told her he wanted to marry her and start a family once his wife was out of the way. She testified about his reasons: the money, the custody of his daughter, his belief that divorce was simply not an option. Her testimony carried the jury through the twisted logic and the cold steps of a plan that had left two people lifeless. Banfield did not accept any of it. He denied responsibility, even from the witness stand and at his sentencing. He admitted that he had cheated on his wife, with Juliana and with other women, but he insisted he had not unalived Christine. He claimed the police had never truly investigated Joseph Ryan, and that the case against him did not match the evidence. He spoke of loving his wife despite his affairs, saying their marriage had worked for them, and he flatly stated that he was not responsible for her passing. His denials did not move the jury. In February 2026, the verdict came down. The jury found Brendan Banfield guilty of the most serious homicide charges, 2 counts in all, for the passings of both his wife and Joseph Ryan. They also convicted him of using a weapon in the crime and of endangering a child, because the couple's young daughter had been in the home, in the middle of a house turned into an unaliving ground. The judge, Penny Azkarate, handed him the sentence that the law required for such a crime: life in prison without the possibility of parole. She did not hide her feelings about what he had done. She called his actions evil and calculated, and she spoke about the near impossible cruelty of disregarding the life of a wife he claimed to love, of luring a completely innocent man into a deadly trap, and of carrying on after the homicides without a care, never once thinking of his own child. The sentencing of Juliana Perez Magalhães came around the same time, and it did not go the way she or the prosecutors expected. Because she had cooperated and testified, the prosecutors recommended that she receive credit for the time she had already served and then be deported back to Brazil, a relatively soft outcome in exchange for her crucial help. The judge rejected that recommendation. Instead, she sentenced Juliana to the maximum allowed under the manslaughter charge, 10 years in prison. The judge noted that the manslaughter charge itself had been an enormous benefit of the deal Juliana struck for testifying, a huge bargain in its own right, and she was not willing to let the sentence be lighter still. Juliana would receive credit for the more than 2 years she had already spent locked up, and she could be released early for good behaviour, possibly a little more than 4 years into her sentence. After completing her time, she will be placed on supervision and then sent back to her home country of Brazil. For the family of Joseph Ryan, the sentencing of the au pair was a moment heavy with anger and grief. They had watched a stranger, their beloved son and nephew and grandson, be lured into a deadly scheme that painted him as an offender. They felt that Juliana, as a woman, a caretaker, and a daughter herself, had chances to stop the whole thing. They believed she could have warned Christine. They believed she could have warned Joe that morning. In their eyes, there was a version of that day where Juliana chose to save 2 lives instead of helping to end them. And the fact that she did not haunts them. Ryan's aunt spoke about how Bamfield did not only take Joe and Christine from the world, but tried to erase the truth of who they were, dressing up a cold-blooded plot as a home invasion and casting an innocent man as an offender. The local prosecutor acknowledged the strange dual nature of Juliana's role. Her testimony, he said, had been invaluable in helping the jury understand the complicated double homicide plot that Banfield had built. Without her account, untangling the scheme for 12 jurors would have been far harder. And yet, he added, no prison sentence could ever truly address the harm her actions had caused. She had been both a participant in the unalivings and the witness who helped bring the mastermind to justice. A person who pulled the trigger and then handed the prosecution its strongest weapon. The Banfield case stands apart from the others in this collection because the betrayal it contains took a different shape. The au pair did not mistreatment the child she was hired to protect. The little girl in that home survived. But the trust placed in Juliana was shattered in its own profound way. She lived in the family's house, helped raise their daughter, and shared their daily life, all while secretly loving the husband and, in the end, helping to homicide the wife. The woman brought in to support a family from the inside became part of the force that destroyed it from the inside. A mother was unalived in her own home. A stranger was lured to his passing and framed. A child lost her mother, and, through his conviction, her father too. And at the heart of it sat an affair that turned into a plot, with an au pair holding the second weapon. There is something uniquely disturbing about a crime built with so much planning, by a man trained to understand how crimes are solved, carried out with the help of the person hired to care for his child. Most of the unalivings in these stories were sudden, the explosions of anger or the cruel impulses of a caregiver alone with a helpless infant. This one was the opposite in its patience and its design. It was thought through over months, dressed up to fool the police, and aimed not at a child, but at a wife and a stranger. The au pair's hands stayed clean of the children she minded, and still, she ended up convicted of helping to take 2 adult lives. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The final case returns to the oldest and most primal fear that runs underneath every story here. It brings the focus back to a child, and to the kind of betrayal that parents dread most, without ever letting themselves picture it. The woman at the centre of it was no stranger pulled in through an affair, and no partner with a hidden record of aggression. She was a beloved, trusted nanny, a woman the children adored and called by an affectionate name. Welcomed into a loving family for years, and in the family's own home, on an ordinary afternoon, she turned on the very children she had been paid to love. Section 10. Josie. Every story so far has circled the same fear, the one that lives quietly in the back of every parent's mind and almost never gets spoken aloud. It is the fear of handing your child to someone you trust and having that trust turn into a weapon. The final case is that fear in its purest and most devastating form. There was no stranger here, no hidden criminal record, no affair that pulled an outsider into a plot. There was a beloved nanny, a woman who had been part of a loving family for years, a woman the children adored so much that they gave her an affectionate name. They called her Josie. And on an ordinary autumn afternoon, in the family's own home, Josie turned on the two children she had been paid to love. The family lived on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, a comfortable, busy neighborhood of apartment buildings and parks and young families. Kevin Krim was a successful executive in digital media, a Harvard graduate who had worked for major companies. His wife, Marina Krim, poured herself into their three children. She was the kind of mother who treasured the small moments, who kept a blog full of the joys of family life, who wrote about her kids with open, overflowing love. The household had three children in it. Lucia, who everyone called Lulu, was 6 years old, bright and full of life. Leo was 2, still a baby in many ways, and in the middle was Nessie, who was 3. The home was the noisy, happy chaos of a family with 3 small children and a dog. Into that home, the Krims had welcomed a nanny named Yoselin Ortega. She was originally from the Dominican Republic, a woman in her early 50s, and she had been helping care for the Krim children for about 2 years. Over that time, she had become a fixture in their lives, woven into the daily rhythm of the family. The children loved her. In the way that little kids do, they shortened her name into something warm and familiar, and Josie became part of their world, a person they trusted completely. By many accounts, the Krims treated Ortega well. This is one of the details that makes the case so hard to understand. The family did not mistreat her or hold her at a distance. They paid for her plane tickets so she could fly home to see her family in the Dominican Republic. On one occasion, they even went along with her on a trip there. Friends of the Krims and friends of Ortega both said that she was close to the children and was treated kindly by the family. In Marina's blog, Ortega appeared as a loved member of the household, almost like family. From the outside, this looked like one of the good arrangements, a nanny who belonged, a family that cared for her. The afternoon that shattered everything was the 25th of October, 2012. That day, Marina took little Nessie to a swimming lesson at a nearby YMCA. It was a small, ordinary errand, the kind that fills the days of a parent with young children. The plan was simple. Ortega would look after Lulu and Leo, and afterward they would all meet up, with Lulu due at a dance class. Marina expected to see Josie and her other 2 children at the appointed time. It was the kind of plan a mother makes 100 times without a flicker of worry, because the children were with someone she trusted. When the time came, Ortega did not show up. Marina waited, and the nanny and the 2 children simply were not there. A small worry began to grow. Something about the missed meeting did not sit right. So Marina gathered up Nessie and headed home to check on everyone, still telling herself, most likely, that there was some simple explanation. She walked into an apartment that felt wrong the moment she entered it. The lights were off. The home that was normally alive with the sounds of 3 children and a dog was eerily, unnaturally quiet. That silence is the kind of thing a parent feels in the body before the mind catches up. Marina moved through the apartment calling out and noticed a light glowing under a bathroom door at the back. The quiet pressed in on her. She would later describe the dread of that moment, the sense that something was deeply and terribly wrong, even before she knew what it was. She opened the bathroom door. Inside, she found her 2 children, Lulu and Leo, lifeless. They had been wounded, and there was blood everywhere. On the floor of that same bathroom was Ortega, who had turned a kitchen blade on herself. Marina knew at once that her eldest was gone, recognizing the empty, fixed look in her little girl's eyes. Beside Lulu lay Leo. In the space of a heartbeat, a mother's entire world collapsed. Marina ran. She fled the apartment, clutching Nessie, and out on the landing she began to scream, a sound she later said she did not know was even inside a human being, a scream that came from a place of pure horror. She had walked in expecting an ordinary afternoon, and instead found the unimaginable. Far away, Kevin Krim was on his way home from a business trip on the West Coast. He had no idea what had happened. He learned of his children's passings in the cruelest way imaginable. Reporters reached him as he got off his plane, and that is how a father found out that 2 of his 3 children had been unalived. He rushed to be with his wife, both of them thrown into a nightmare that would never fully end. The details of what Ortega had done were almost too much to bear. Little Lulu, 6 years old, had been wounded more than 30 times. The sheer number tells a story of its own. A child does not receive that many wounds without a struggle, without trying, in whatever small way a 6-year-old can, to survive. Leo, the 2-year-old, had been wounded 5 times. After unaliving the children, Ortega had plunged the blade into her own neck and wrists. Prosecutors would later argue that she had timed her self-harm deliberately, waiting until the moment Marina discovered the bodies before turning the blade on herself. Ortega did not pass. She survived her self-inflicted wounds and was rushed to a hospital where she was treated under the constant watch of the police. Her injuries and her condition meant that she could not be properly questioned for a long time. The woman who held the answers to what had happened in that bathroom lay in a hospital bed, beyond the reach of the investigators trying to understand the horror. Later, 2 state psychiatrists examined her and determined that she was mentally well enough to stand trial. And so began a long wait for justice that stretched on for years. The central question of the case was never really whether Ortega had unalived the children. That much was clear, and her own lawyer would not dispute it. The question that hung over everything was why? Why would a trusted nanny, a woman the children loved, a woman the family had treated with kindness, harm 2 small children in cold blood? And tangled up with that question was another one. Was she so mentally ill at the time that she could not be held responsible for what she did? The search for a motive led into uncomfortable territory, and in the end, it never produced a clean answer. Prosecutors pointed to money. Ortega was paid $18 an hour, and she was struggling financially. When she had asked Marina for more hours because she needed the money, Marina had suggested she could take on some extra housework. Ortega was upset by this. She felt, by some accounts, resentment toward the family, a bitterness about her situation set against the comfortable life of her wealthy employers. There were reports that she and Marina had argued. The prosecution suggested that resentment and jealousy of Marina, combined with Ortega's inability to provide for her own son, had built up and sent her into a calculated rage. But even the prosecutors admitted there was no clear, satisfying motive. The grievances they pointed to, the money troubles, the disagreement over hours, were the kinds of frustrations that millions of workers feel without ever harming anyone, let alone unaliving children. And those grievances sat awkwardly against everything else that was known about the family. The Krims had paid for Ortega's trips home. They had vacationed with her. The people who knew them said the children were close to her and that she was treated well. The motive, in the end, remained a kind of void at the center of the case. Something had curdled inside Yoselin Ortega, and no one could fully explain what or why. The trial began on the 1st of March, 2018, more than 5 years after the children passed. It would run for about 6 weeks. The first witness was Marina Krim, and her testimony was almost unbearable to hear. She walked the jury through the silence of that apartment, the light under the bathroom door, the moment she opened it. She described knowing instantly that her daughter was lifeless from the look in her eyes. The grief overwhelmed her more than once, and she fled the witness stand in tears on 2 occasions. At one point, her anguish boiled over into fury, and she faced Ortega directly and called her evil, called her a liar. A mother, forced to sit in a courtroom and recount the homicide of her children by the woman they had called Josie, let her rage and her sorrow pour out in front of everyone. Ortega's defense did not argue that she was innocent of the unalivings. Instead, her lawyer argued that she was too mentally ill to be held responsible for them. The defense described a woman suffering from a severe break with reality, plagued by deep depression, hearing voices that told her to unalive the children. They painted a picture of a person slowly falling apart on the inside while holding it together on the outside. Someone who was quietly disintegrating but did not want to lose her job. In a video of Ortega being questioned years earlier, she denied that she had been taken over by the devil. The defense's case rested on the idea that the reasons for what she did lay buried in a sick and broken mind, not in a conscious choice. The prosecution argued the opposite with force. They told the jury that Ortega knew exactly what she was doing, that she had carried out a planned and deliberate attack, and that there was no solid evidence she was too ill to understand her actions. In the closing argument, a prosecutor described the homicides in stark terms, saying that every wound and every slash had a purpose, and that the purpose was to end the lives of those children. The picture the prosecution painted was of a woman fully aware of the horror she was committing, choosing each blow. The jury of 6 men and 6 women listened to weeks of gut-wrenching testimony and gruesome detail. They deliberated for about 2 days. On the 18th of April 2018, they delivered their verdict. They found Yoselin Ortega guilty on all 4 counts against her, 2 of first-degree homicide and 2 of second-degree homicide. They rejected the claim that she was too mentally ill to be responsible. The jury had concluded that she understood the consequences of what she was doing when she unalived Lulu and Leo. As the verdict was read, Ortega showed no reaction at all. She simply stared straight ahead, blank, as the words that would send her to prison for the rest of her life filled the courtroom. The decision weighed heavily on the people who made it. One juror, a father of 2 grown children, was tearful as he spoke afterward, describing how difficult the decision had been for all of them. The Manhattan District Attorney thanked the jury for their work through what he called an incredibly difficult and heartbreaking trial, and spoke of his heart going out to the Krim family, saying that, as a father himself, he could not begin to imagine their pain. The sentencing came on the 14th of May 2018. The judge gave Ortega the maximum the law allowed: life in prison with no possibility of parole, handed down as 2 life sentences stacked one after the other. She would never walk free again. Before the sentence was imposed, Ortega spoke briefly through an interpreter. She said she was very sorry for everything that had happened and asked for forgiveness from God and from Marina and Kevin. She said she hoped no one would ever go through what she had gone through, and that her life was now in the hands of God. It was a rare show of emotion from a woman who had sat through most of her trial without expression. Then the parents spoke, and their words carried the full weight of what had been taken from them. Marina told the court that Ortega had tried to destroy what she and Kevin had built, a happy family, and that in this she had failed. She spoke of Lulu and Leo as powerful forces, 2 stars now who would always lead the family forward. She refused to let the woman who unalived her children claim the final victory over them. Kevin's words were harder and colder. the fury of a father who had lost 2 children. He called Ortega evil and utterly dangerous, and said she deserved to live and rot and pass behind bars. He said she should know nothing of hope. In the aftermath, the Crims tried to turn their unbearable loss into some kind of protection for other families. They came to believe that Ortega's relatives and friends had lied about her character and her experience to help her get hired, faking references to make her seem more qualified and trustworthy than she was. Kevin pushed for a new law, named in honor of his children, that would make it a crime to submit false information and references when applying for a job caring for children. Their hope was that no other family would be deceived the way they felt they had been. The case sent a shockwave through working parents around the world. It struck the deepest fear of every family that relies on someone else to help raise their children. The press connected it to a best-selling novel out of France that explored the fraught relationship between a working mother and the woman she hires to care for her young children. A sign of how deeply the story had burrowed into the public imagination. For many parents, the homicide of the Crim children was the nightmare they tried never to think about, suddenly made real. What lingers most about this case is the name. Josie. The children loved her enough to give her that warm little name, the kind of nickname reserved for the people closest to a child's heart. They trusted her in the complete, unguarded way that only small children can trust. And the woman behind that affectionate name became the person who ended their lives in their own bathroom. There is no betrayal deeper than that. No version of the broken trust story that cuts closer to the bone. The danger was not at the door. The danger was the person the children ran to, the one they felt safest with. The absence of a clear reason makes it worse, somehow. With some of the other cases, there is at least a thread to grasp, a moment of rage, a cover-up, a plot with a cold logic to it. With Ortega, the why dissolves the harder you look at it. A family that treated her well, children who adored her, years of apparent closeness. And then, an afternoon of horror, followed by a blank stare in a courtroom and an apology that explained nothing. The mind wants a reason large enough to match the horror, and no such reason was ever found. Yoselin Ortega will spend the rest of her life in prison, which is the most the justice system could do. It cannot bring back a 6-year-old who loved to dance, or a 2-year-old who was barely beginning his life. It cannot undo the moment a mother opened a bathroom door, or the words a father heard from reporters on an airport tarmac. Lulu and Leo are gone, and the woman they called Josie is the reason why. 10 cases now sit side by side. 10 times a child or a family handed their trust to someone and had it turned against them. The names and the places and the details differ. The babysitters and au pairs and nannies, each their own kind of person. Their crimes, each their own kind of horror. Yet running underneath all of them is a single thread. One uncomfortable truth that connects the teenager in Florida to the au pair in Virginia, to the woman called Josie in Manhattan. Pulling that thread and looking honestly at what it reveals about trust, about warning signs, and about the people we let into our homes, is the last thing left to do. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.